We were repainting the treads on the walkway up to the front of the step this week, and since God gave us a good sunny couple of days, they're plenty dry now, which means it is time for that most satisfying job of pulling up painter's tape. The painter's tape, of course, is this barrier that you put down between the place you want the paint to go and the places you want to keep free from paint. It's this barrier so that if you get a little bit on there, it's okay because it comes up when you're done, and boy, isn't that satisfying? The whole thing just sort of pulls right up. And you see in that moment that this barrier was never meant to be permanent. This barrier can just be crumpled up on the authority of the pastor when it's time, because now these steps are ready to be used. This isn't wet paint anymore, and we're done worrying about getting paint splashing over. This is now ready to go, so the barrier can go away. It was never meant to be permanent. Now, I suppose if you had never seen painter's tape before, or if all your life long you had seen that blue tape, that blue line separating the painted area from the plain concrete, you might think to yourself, no, that's supposed to last forever. It's supposed to keep that area separate from this area over here. But no, the barrier isn't meant to last forever. The barrier can be crumpled up and set aside when it's time, and now you got functional steps. I want you to hold that image in mind, of the idea of the barrier that can be on the right authority, pulled up, and the division no longer has to separate anymore. Because the writer of the book we call Ephesians says that Jesus has done something just that dramatic, except not with a line between white paint and concrete, but between humanity, across humanity, and all of our difference. The writer of the letter we call Ephesians in the second chapter says this. Remember, he's writing to folks who had been outsiders, folks who fit into the category of Gentiles, people who weren't Jewish and had been welcomed into the church. He says, remember that at one time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers to the covenants and the promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace. In his flesh, he had made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall, that is, the hostility between us. He has abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances, that he might create in himself one new humanity in place of the two, thus making peace, and might reconcile both groups to God in one body through the cross, putting to death that hostility through it. In so many words, it's the apostle saying, there had been this divider, this line, this boundary between groups of people. There were people who traced their family line through Judaism and the Torah and its particular way of life. It was cultural, it was language, it was religion, it was heritage, all those things. And then this whole other group, everybody else in the world, fell into the category that in the ancient world they called Gentiles. You were Jewish or Gentile. And for a long, long time, the assumption was that boundary is permanent and is fixed and is rigid, and you don't belong if you are in the wrong category. And the early Christian community discovered that God was leading all kinds of people who crossed that line, people who did not grow up in Judaism, people whose ethnicity, whose skin color were different, whose language were different, all this difference, and that they were coming to faith in Jesus as well, and they were receiving the Holy Spirit, and they were willing to put their lives on the line, just like the first Christians who had happened to all be Jewish did. And the writer to the Ephesians, who's watching all this happen and is now watching these people who had been outsiders be welcomed, says this is what God's up to. God's in the business of taking up barriers and boundaries and saying these weren't meant to be permanent. God's made a new kind of community, a new way to be human, where those differences don't have to define us or separate us anymore. And at the same time, where we don't pretend that the differences and distinctives about different groups of people aren't there, right? Like our barrier here, I pull up the white tape, and it doesn't mean that the white tread doesn't still have this special grippy paint on it. And this part, it still has its distinctive color. It's not that when you pull up the barrier, all of a sudden those things don't matter, but that they don't have to be separated by a line of painter's tape anymore. That wasn't meant to be permanent, and imagining that the barrier had to be there forever is missing the point of how painter's tape works. In the ancient Christian community, it was a way of saying also, you might have come from Judaism, and to become a Christian didn't mean that you had to give up observing the festivals, or speaking Hebrew, or remembering the observances that were part of Israel's ancient memory. And if you were Gentile, you didn't have to convert to Judaism first to become a Christian. You didn't have to be circumcised. You didn't have to keep kosher. Those distinctives were okay. That you could continue speaking whatever language or whatever background and whatever national cultural things you had. You didn't have to throw those all away to become a Christian. To become a follower of Jesus included all kinds of people, because, at least as the writer to Ephesians says it, the old barrier, the dividing wall that kept people like us from people like them separate, has been taken down. I would like to say that we've learned this lesson, and that this is just a first century problem, because now we know better, that Gentile people are allowed to become Christians. The early church, that was the way they framed it. That was the question. If you were Jewish, certainly you could be a follower of Jesus, but if you were Gentile, did you have to become like Jewish people first in order to belong? And the church wrestled with it, and they said, no, you can belong regardless of where you come from, whatever your background is. I'd like to say, well, and we learned that lesson once and for all. The trouble is, like it's been famously observed by all kinds of folks, from Dr. King to modern voices, even still today, Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. We're still divided, maybe not necessarily on Jewish and Gentile lines, but we sure do divide ourselves along all sorts of other lines, from skin color to language to tradition to background, and we have this way of saying, well, you kind of belong, but we don't really want you with us, or we'll say you belong, but you have to become exactly like us. Man, we still wrestle with that. We still struggle with what, for the writer of Ephesians, was a temporary barrier that was never supposed to be permanent. The differences across different ways of being human aren't something we have to be afraid of, or sweep under the rug, or pretend aren't there. We can own them and celebrate them and sing songs in all sorts of different languages, and celebrate people who come from every different culture and background and skin color and ethnicity to belong in this thing called community. And instead of saying you're doing it wrong, you're being Christian wrong if you don't look like my way of doing it, the writer to the Ephesians says, no, all of us in some way have been welcomed in as outsiders, especially if you come from a non-Jewish background. Anybody else who's Gentile, you've been welcomed in as an outsider. And when you know what it's like to be welcomed in, to say, yeah, you might not have belonged before, but the barrier wasn't permanent, you're welcome here. When you know what it's like to receive that welcome and hear somebody say, you belong, you matter, we welcome you as you are, then part of your responsibility is to welcome other people who are waiting to hear that this love is for them too. That's what I think is so radical, so amazing about the Christian faith and about the community that forms around it. That instead of saying this is a religious club and you have to be exactly like us to belong, and if you're not like that, sorry, the membership is not for you. We began as this movement that reached out in every direction, literally every direction on the map, and said, whatever people we can find, yep, they belong to you, can be included as well. And the old boundaries and barriers and dividing walls that we used to think had to be there, and they were permanent, they don't have to be. They aren't permanent. Jesus' job is in pulling down those walls and ripping up that painter's tape to create a new kind of humanity that isn't based on sameness. To be honest, almost all of human history otherwise has been, how do we make a group based on sameness? We all have the exact same politics, or the exact same nationality, or speak the exact same language, or we all like the exact same kind of food. And the Christian community has dared to live on the promise that what makes us belong is God's grace that grabs hold of us, and not our sameness. Which means that it's okay. In fact, it's a good thing to be able to celebrate the diversity, the difference among us, to sing songs from different languages, to learn the examples and the teachings and the wisdom that people from very, very different backgrounds have to offer us, and to discover that God's able to do something through all of us together, making a new kind of humanity. Maybe you know what it's like to be loved that way, to be the outsider and to hear welcome. Maybe now it's our turn to find somebody who's waiting to hear that this welcome is for them, that they're belonging is already extended and offered. And whatever the barriers were, they've been ripped up on Jesus' authority just as easily and as permanently as pulling up painter's tape so you can use the stairs. Now these are functional. Now you can do something with it. Now that the barriers are pulled up, now we can do the work God's called us to do and to be in the world. Let's get to it. There's somebody you know who, for whatever reason, has become convinced they don't belong, that the love of Jesus isn't for them. Maybe sometimes some religious people have said quite plainly, nope, you don't belong, you can't belong. Maybe it's been that sort of unspoken cold shoulder. Maybe they're just waiting for somebody to say, this is for you. You matter to God and you're beloved, and I'm here to welcome you into a community of people who will live that love out as well. Let's find those people right in our neighborhoods, right in our families, right in our own circles already, and say the barrier's been pulled down. It was never meant to be permanent in the first place. Maybe you and I can get to that work starting right now. See you on Sunday.